And on the day when it was to be presented in the church, it was Dean Haney who had the task of reading from that service book. Emotions were stirred, feelings were very keen on that day. And it is recorded in St. Giles on a plaque that reminds us that on the 23rd July 1637, a brave Scotswoman by the name of Janet Geddes struck the first blow for civil and religious liberty. And that was to be the beginning of a struggle that was to last for almost 50 years. Dean Haney proceeded to read from the service book. Jenny Geddes was roused, and she lifted the stool on which she was sitting, hurling it towards the pulpit, and crying in her vernacular tongue, "Villain, ye wanna say mass in my lug. You won't say mass in my ear." The Scottish people were not opposed to read prayers, but they were opposed to the reading of an English liturgy, which they saw to be a return to the pre-Reformation situation in Scotland, and they opposed it very fiercely. And so we find that this event, which is discounted and discredited by many historians today, was really the spark that set ablaze the tinder of feeling that was to be in Scotland at this time. For only 7 months later, the events on which we are to concentrate our attention now broke in Scotland. Alexander Henderson at this particular time was minister in Lookers in Fife. It was an eventful occasion on the day when he was introduced to the congregation in Lookers. He had very strong episcopal views, and the people of Lookers were Presbyterian. And to oppose any introduction of Alexander Henderson, they closed every door of the church, so that the only way of access to the church that day was by the windows. His installation was duly carried through. Sometime later, Alexander Henderson went to a communion service in the district, and there he heard Robert Bruce, one of the eminent ministers of the day, preaching at this communion service. Henderson was somewhat surprised and indeed astounded when he heard Robert Bruce choose his text. His text are the well-known words from John's Gospel, chapter 10. "He that entereth not by the door, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber." These words gripped the heart of Alexander Henderson, and he records for us that they were the first means of his conversion to Christ. And from that point onwards, Henderson's whole position was radically changed. We find that he became one of the staunchest contenders for Presbyterianism in Scotland. And he was to be one of the men who was to be at the very heart of the story of the National Covenant. He had been engaged in controversy on more than one occasion, but this event of the National Covenant, the Magna Carta of Scottish religious liberty, was to be the means of Alexander Henderson's gifts shining forth and his leadership being displayed. Henderson, along with Johnston of Warriston, who was a king's counsel and a brilliant lawyer, and the Earl of Loudon, who represented the noblemen of Scotland, were the three men who were the main architects of the National Covenant. The Covenant was drawn up in the Parliament Hall. It was carefully drawn up and was just one of many covenants which had passed through the story of the Scottish Church. But in it, they sought to declare their position, to defend their reformed principles, and to set forth their opposition to all who would seek to impose anything on the Scottish Church at this time. After the drawing up of the National Covenant in the Parliament Hall, these three men took it to Greyfriars Church, and there in the church the National Covenant was presented to the people. Wednesday, February the 28th, 1638, was one of the most momentous days in the history of the Church in Scotland. For it was on that day that the National Covenant was brought here to Greyfriars Church. People had flocked from every part of southern Scotland to come to witness the events that were taking place here in the church and in the churchyard. The church was packed, and it is reckoned that some 60,000 people were in the city at that particular time. The proceedings were solemn. Alexander Henderson opened the service with prayer. Then the fair parchment was presented to the people. The Earl of Loudon asked for objections. A few raised objections, and these were answered. Then silence fell on the great company. Then the great event began. First, the nobles, men with names like Rothes, Montrose, Boyd, Balcarras, they came forward and signed their names. Then followed the burgesses, and on the covenant many of these names are so clearly written that one can identify the places from which they came. After this signing, the covenant was taken away and was copied, and then it was presented to the ordinary people. It was a great day in Scottish history, and things were never to be the same after that particular event. After the signing of the National Covenant, religious revival broke out in many parts of Scotland, and Scotland became a covenanted nation. As usually happens with great events of national history, a great deal of tradition is associated with them, and the National Covenant was no exception. Largely through artists' impressions and other factors, this stone is claimed to be the stone on which the National Covenant was signed here in the churchyard. This is now regarded as historically inaccurate, but let us say that if it was not used for the signing of the covenant, it was certainly used for the presentation of the covenant to the great company that was assembled here in the churchyard. When eventually the ordinary people had opportunity to sign the covenant, the enthusiasm that had gripped the people that day here in Greyfriars Churchyard was seen in the way in which they signed the covenant. For tradition tells us that many of them could not wait for the writing materials to become available, and many of them pierced their veins and signed with their own blood, some of them even adding the words, "till death." So we can see that these events of the 28th February 1638, which were associated with the National Covenant, were to be far-reaching in their implications. As one writer reminds us, this was no uprising of a cowed peasantry, but it was indeed the latent religious feeling of ordinary people being expressed as they sought in their own way to express just what the Scriptures meant to them. For this was what was at the heart of the whole situation regarding the National Covenant. They declared that they would only be directed and guided by what the Scripture said in terms of the way that they worshipped, in the way that they understood